everyone, and welcome back to the Smart Tea podcast, where we talk about the lives of scientists and innovators who have shaped our world. I'm Arti.
And I'm Arpita.
How are you doing?
I am tired today.
Just especially tired?
Arti and I were just chatting before we hit record, and I said that I feel like I particularly showed up looking like a gremlin today. And
she looks great. I think you look great.
This is thankfully not a video podcast, which is maybe for the best for everyone's eyeballs, but I'm looking at myself in the camera display and I'm just like trying to keep my eyeballs open. There's just puffies under my eyes. Okay,
no.
Well, this is mostly my fault. I definitely went to bed too late and I wasn't even doing anything interesting. And secondly, I have 2 cats and they don't normally sleep with me, but I guess my partner had a lapse in judgment and so they slept with us at night. And as you can imagine, they stepped all over me and all over my head and kept waking me up.
What is it about cats and they do that?
I don't know. Like, I'm normally really happy. They're normally very well behaved at night, and they usually just sleep in one spot. But something about last night, I think none of us could find a comfy spot, and I don't think anyone slept well. But now I'm just like, you know in cartoons when they use clothespins to keep their eyeballs open? Like, that's how I feel right now.
Oh, no. Well, I kind of had the opposite. It's funny. I kind of had the opposite problem because you're a cat person and I'm a dog person. So, of course, we have the opposite problems. Like, as you can tell, I'm in a different recording space. So normally I record in my bedroom and the closet in my bedroom has been terrible forever. So we were like, let's redo the closet. Let's repaint everything. And so I had to move everything out into the guest room. So now I'm sitting in my guest room. And my dog did not take the move well. We literally moved like 2 rooms down and he's like, the world is ending. And so he was like throwing up and he was just like having a horrible time of it. Yeah. The stress was causing him all these like stomach issues and like, oh my God, it's really not all that deep. He got over it in a day, but he also wanted to sleep in my bed with me because he was like, this is terrible. Mom, can I sleep with you? And normally he doesn't, but I was feeling like, okay,
what
fine.
are you supposed to do?
Yeah, like he's giving you those eyes like, please, my stomach is upset. I have to sleep with you. And so I was like, okay, fine, get up here. And so he did, but then I apparently am just the most restless sleeper. So I was like kicking at him. I was like kicking him in the face and like the poor thing, like he was just like, this is not worth it. And he went back down to his normal bed in the middle of the night. He just got fed up with me and he was like, nope, like that's it, bye.
Your dog Cairo and I had the same night, apparently.
Yeah, apparently we did. Yeah. I was just like, I'm so sorry. This is how I sleep. My bad. But anyway, maybe then we should get into this episode so that you can go to sleep right after. So it's your turn to tell a story. So who are we talking about today?
Yes, I'm really excited to tell you about today's story. We're talking about Élie Metchnikoff, who was actually a listener request. Shout out to Margaret for requesting Élie Metchnikoff's story. But I wanted to start by, just like asking you a really broad question. What do you think about the science of aging or the aging industry? What are your thoughts?
Oh, fascinating. My mom actually works at a company that does aging research. And it's really interesting. Like, I think the idea behind it is more about aging well and increasing your health span rather than your lifespan necessarily for that particular company. I also studied C. elegans during my PhD. And there's a whole field of study in longevity with C. elegans. They're these little tiny nematode worms that are 1 millimeter long. And you can actually freeze them and they will remain frozen forever. And then you can thaw them like 10 years later, they're alive again. It's like cryogenically frozen worms. You can starve them and they'll stay alive for forever and ever. Like well, not ever, but like weeks, they'll enter this state where they'll just stay alive. And so a lot of people have been studying that. So I never studied it myself, but I just found it really fascinating that these little worms could kind of become immortal for 3
Yeah.
weeks,
No, definitely. Like, it definitely feels like there are really great model organisms, or basically these animals that we study as models for many different types of diseases. And I do think that aging is sort of being thought of as a disease and something to focus on, or like something to understand how people age, and then if we can figure that out, how to either
Mhm.
slow it down or maximize life, like you said. And it really is this huge industry, even outside of science, just consumer products that are selling you things in order to not age and live longer. And I feel like
Yeah.
this is a really good intro because Eli Metchnikoff, who is our scientist today, is thought of as the father of immunology and the person who really brought science to the aging industry.
Yeah.
And we will cover this in more detail, but he's actually the person who coined the term gerontology, which is the science of aging. So he really is kind of like an innovator in this field. So I'm really excited to tell you about him.
I'm excited to hear about him.
Okay, so let's dive in. Eli Metchnikoff was born on May 16th in 1845 in what we now know as Ukraine. His father was Moldovan and he had an Ukrainian Jewish mother. And we know a lot about his childhood because his wife Olga wrote a biography about him. So
Nice.
she starts this by talking about his childhood, and it kind of feels like deja vu talking about all the other scientists we've talked about. But, he was
Mhm.
a really curious and observant kid. He was always chasing bugs and playing outside and like looking for animals. He was the youngest of 6. And it does seem like he was a very typical younger sibling. He seems pretty annoying and very chatty.
Yeah.
And he really only stopped talking and annoying his parents when he was hyper fixated on something new. So, like a new insect or a new butterfly or something like that. So, that was the only time that
Mhm.
he shut up. So, definitely seems par for
Nice.
the course for a younger sibling.
Yes.
So, Metchnikoff was born at a time where modern medicine was really getting started. Most people didn't really understand how diseases spread, and getting something like cholera or typhoid was super scary. And we covered this in a previous episode, but kind of around the same time, around the turn of the century, a lot of doctors were still practicing bloodletting. And just like we talked about with Joseph Lister, surgery was really barbaric.
Mhm.
And really similar to Lister, Metchnikoff witnessed all of this suffering and really wanted to do his best to reduce people's pain when it came to medical care. And so his interest really led him to becoming a zoologist.
Oh.
So he's growing up right around the time that Darwin has published his theory of evolution. And
Mhm.
like we know, this really changed the way people thought about the world, where everyone was really a creationist or believed that God created the world intentionally. And
Right.
so the main goal of scientists at this time, including Metchnikoff, was to test Darwin's idea that all life on Earth came from a common ancestor. And so in his
Mhm.
early career, this is what he was really motivated by and what he wanted to really study. So when he was 19, he went to Germany to study marine life on this very small island in the North Sea called Heligoland. And he was working in a lab there, and just like somebody else we know, studied nematodes and flatworms.
Yes.
And he wrote his doctoral thesis on the genetics of cuttlefish.
Oh.
And a lot of the work that he did in this early stage was on anatomy and physiology of these species, and one of his interests was digestion, and this will become important later.
Cuttlefish are really interesting creatures, right? Aren't they? This is like a non sequitur completely, but don't they like change color or something fascinating? Like there's something
I thought
fascinating about
cuttlefish
them.
were also interesting because of limb regeneration. Did I make that up?
Yeah, you're right. They possess the remarkable ability to fully regenerate an
Nice.
amputated arm. Yeah, nice. Okay, so yeah, because I think a lot of people do there is some overlap in regeneration
Yeah.
and longevity. So I wonder if that also kind of, you know, piqued his
I
interest.
think based on the story, he probably wasn't quite there yet in his scientific journey, but that is a great thought.
Hmm.
So after he does this PhD work in cuttlefish, he's 22. He goes to become a docent at Novorossiya University, and just like a lot of universities around this time, it was religiously affiliated. Even though he publicly said that he was an atheist, which was honestly kind of crazy for this time.
Yeah, that would not be met with, you know.
Yeah, I couldn't really find a lot about his religious beliefs. It was like in a few different sources. It's like Metchnikoff was an atheist, but I really wanted to know more. I was like, based
Hmm.
on everything that we know about, Buckland and like all of these people who were so deeply entrenched in the
Yeah.
church because it really seemed like that's where the science happened. I'm like really curious to know how people
Hmm.
reacted to this. But yeah, I couldn't really find anything super detailed on that, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, and especially around Darwin's
Yeah.
time, like I would imagine that if you're a scientist, you either have to work to try and kind of fit evolution into your beliefs somehow, or
Yeah.
you have to be an atheist and completely reject. Like it almost seems like that at the time it had to be one or the other.
Yeah, definitely agree. And Novorossiya was also religiously affiliated, but here he became a professor of zoology and anatomy.
Cool.
And while he's a professor, he met one of his students. Her name was Ludmila Fedorovich, and he married her.
Beautiful name.
And we don't really know a lot about their love story, but it's very clear that he cared very deeply about her. However, very soon after they were married, a few years later, she was diagnosed with tuberculosis.
Oh no.
And today, TB is, you'll be pretty sick, but it's not a death sentence. But in the late 19th century, it was so
Yeah.
sad and so devastating. It's also just a really slow and painful death. And so basically, Metchnikoff had to watch his wife very
Hmm.
slowly slip away. Um,
Oh, that's so
they
hard.
traveled, I know. He tried so hard. They traveled to places with like better climate, like sunnier places. Like he really tried his best to take care of her, but as expected, she eventually died.
Hmm.
And then Metchnikoff went into a very deep depression and attempted suicide via morphine overdose.
Oh my goodness.
Very shortly after that, in 1875, he married another student.
Okay, so he took some time,
Yeah.
got over it. Wait, how long was it between the two? Like,
Uh, a year and a half.
oh,
Yeah,
okay,
not
so
that.
not that much time.
This student's name is Olga Belokoptovia, and she's the one who wrote the biography.
Really good job. Really good job with that name. Really good.
And we could maybe a little bit like skim over this next section. Olga was a 16-year-old high school student with
Yeah.
an interest in natural
Oh
sciences.
dear.
Yeah, let's just glaze over this.
Okay, because like when you said student, I thought you meant like PhD student, which I was already questioning a little bit, but at least, a master's or PhD student or something would have
No,
been,
no.
yeah. All right. It was a different time.
He 30s and or maybe like late 20s and she's 16.
Oh
But
boy.
anyway,
Not the best.
um
Okay.
not the best. But this really turns into a little bit of a deja vu situation for him because very shortly after they got married, Olga got typhoid and got very, very
Oh
sick.
my God. This is bad luck. I would start to think, like, is it me? Like, am I making these people sick somehow?
I think that's exactly what he thought because he then lost the will to live, and this led to his second suicide attempt. He intentionally infected himself with a tick-borne disease, and he was really just
Oh my God.
hoping that both of them would die together.
Wow.
Fortunately, this story has a happy ending. Neither of them died, but this second encounter that he had with death, both, like watching a loved one die with his first wife, and then
Hmm.
watching Olga become very sick, and for him to attempt suicide twice, he really changed his outlook on life because they both survived. And it felt like he had like a new lease on life. So he was re inspired and he really poured all this energy into his research. But also, he became very fascinated with the idea of death and how to avoid death altogether.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I see. I can totally see that. Yeah,
Yeah.
two near-death experiences will do that for you.
Right. And it's like he has this very dual perspective, right? Like, not only did he near death twice, but he also
Mhm.
watched two people who were very, very close to him also deal with death. One who
Yeah.
succumbed, and then the other who came really close also. So he has
Yeah.
this perspective from like a few different angles. And then he becomes really interested in death.
Yeah.
So I was just going to like put a little aside in here where, throughout history, people have tried to live forever. Like, I feel like there's
Mhm.
folklores and tall tales, and every culture has this story about, people who want to live forever.
Yeah, it's this great, like, mythical thing too, like the Fountain of
Yeah.
Youth and, like,
Yep.
it's this amazing treasure. Yeah,
Exactly.
immortality. Mhm.
And I think what's really interesting is that Metchnikoff enters the story at a really interesting intersection where he's now in the world of science and medicine. So this idea of like
Mhm.
death, avoiding death is now being met with science and cells and evolution and all these new ideas that are coming into play. So he has this fascination that is like, millennia old, but he also is like bringing this new insight into the study of death and aging, which hasn't really been thought of before. So he's
Yeah.
kind of entering this conversation at a very interesting time.
Yeah.
So in 1882, he started working at the Pasteur Institute alongside Pasteur himself.
Nice.
He and Olga take a trip to Sicily while he's working there. He and Olga are staying by the seaside at a cottage in Italy overlooking the bright blue sea. They're having a great time.
Sounds beautiful.
I know. So they're really doing the same thing again, where they go on these science vacations.
Oh.
This is another vacation.
Oh my gosh, another scientist who goes to the beautiful Italian seaside to go
Yeah,
to medical
for
institutions.
science. For
Okay, for
science, yeah.
science.
He's going to Italy for science.
Mhm.
Um, so while he's there, the sea is home to all sorts of really cool marine creatures. And his wife, Olga, would go out to explore Sicily during the day, and Metchnikoff would spend his days in the cottage staring at jars filled with seawater and tiny organisms. And
Mhm.
he became really fascinated with starfish and their larvae. And
Oh.
so while he was looking at the larvae, so he has these big jars and he has a microscope and he's looking at seawater and he's looking at the larvae. And
Mhm.
while he's looking at the larva, he sees that there are tiny little cells inside each larva. And
Okay.
at this point, he knew what cells were. He knew that cells existed. He knew that cells made up other organisms. So that part wasn't new. But what he
Alright.
noticed were that some of these little cells inside the larva were eating other bits inside the larva. They were engulfing them somehow.
So they engulfing other cells or just other little, like, random stuff that was within the larva?
The second bit.
Okay. The second stuff. Okay.
The second
Okay.
thing. So
Okay.
he's seeing that there's cells inside the larva. He's also seeing that there's some other floaty bits around.
Mhm.
And he sees that the cells are eating the floaty bits.
Oh, okay.
He made a hypothesis that maybe the cells were eating the tiny particles because they didn't want the tiny particles to be there. So it's a defense mechanism.
Oh, interesting.
It does
Yeah.
feel, I'm not really sure how you got there, but
Yeah.
we'll let the story
He
play
had
out.
that okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're gonna let the story play out.
Yeah.
So then he was like, "Can I recreate this?" Just like a good scientist. So he
Mhm.
start to put thorns into these larvae, and he wanted to see what happened. And what happened was that these same little cells came and tried to attack the thorn because it was a foreign object. And
Oh,
as a result
okay.
of this experiment, he started to wonder if this applied to humans and other organisms, and if there were other cells within us that helped, attack things that were not meant to be there. This story continues on, but we can just pause there because he makes this really very monumental discovery here, and he's not even
Mhm.
entirely aware of it.
I was just I was just gonna ask, so does he realize at this point that it's very particular specialized cells that are making the attack, or has he not figured that out yet?
He has not figured that out yet. So yeah, let's continue.
Okay, yes. Okay.
Let's continue. No,
Moving on.
I
Yeah.
feel like we're both thinking about the same thing, but
Yeah.
let's let Metchnikoff lead us there.
Okay, yes. Okay, sounds good. Yes.
So after this, he finds this and he's like, there's these tiny little cells that have this job that is to eat floaty bits. And he becomes really interested in the study of microbes, and
Mhm.
especially in this idea that maybe there are these natural defense mechanisms. And so this was really the beginning of immunology as a field. Like, people did
Yeah.
not believe that our bodies had defense mechanisms at all. They just thought that they were vessels for sickness. And it was like, you were going to get sick at some point, and once you get sick, you're entirely screwed. Like, your life is over.
Oh,
But didn't necessarily
interesting.
believe that your body had ways to fight it off.
So, that's an interesting thing, because I never thought about that before, because a lot of times when I get sick, like with a cold or something, I'm just like, whatever, I'm just going to write it out and drink
Yeah.
tea and let my immune system take care of it. And I sometimes don't even take medicine, really. I just wait for it to go away. But it sounds like at the time it was like you either have a treatment or you don't. And so people hadn't realized that, I guess, you can recover without taking a medicine or taking a treatment.
You're thinking about this very much like a scientist, and you remember that
Okay.
most people were very religious, and so they probably just thought that God allowed them to live or didn't allow them to live.
Ah, okay, okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that doesn't okay. Yeah, you're right. I was thinking about it very very too scientifically.
You were
Okay.
too scientific. You were too
I
scientific.
I need to take my mind back to the 1800s, early 1900s. All right.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah.
Because yeah, like, people didn't really believe at this time. I think this was maybe just at the cusp of when this mentality was changing, but people
Mhm.
didn't really believe that their bodies had this ability to fight disease. And so Metchnikoff realizes that, different from larvae, which are, just a few cells clustered together for starfish, that in animals that have blood and more complex organisms, there's a very special type of particles. This answers your question, called
Yeah.
a white blood cell, which gathers at any injury site. And he hypothesized, based on what he learned with the starfish, that
Mhm.
the white blood cell allowed the body to kill and remove bacteria and microbes. And so he discusses this hypothesis with his colleagues, who suggest to him the term phagocyte, which is a
Mhm.
cell that engulfs, for all of these particles that he finds that can surround and kill pathogens. And so pathogens are just anything that we don't want in our body, or foreign invaders.
Right.
Yeah, so
Cool.
that was a great get.
Yeah.
Metchnikoff got there eventually.
Yes. Yeah. It's really hard when you already know the answer.
I
You're like,
know, I
in
know.
hindsight, like, yeah. But
It's like difficult. It's difficult to sit in the 21st century and hear about some of these discoveries, because it seems so obvious. Like, it seems like
yeah.
such a core facet of how we think of, like, what you just said about you being sick. It's like, people say things like, "Oh, let your body do its thing,"
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
they didn't know that. Or even with, Lister, it's like, "Oh, we should probably clean things."
Yeah, it's,
Like,
like, so basic,
it
like
feels basic. I know. And this next bit is actually really interesting, because we're sitting here talking about how obvious this is. But this is 1883, and he presents his findings for the first time, where he's like, there are these types of cells that are native to mammals and all these different types of organisms that are meant to fight disease. And this was
Mhm.
not well received.
Of course not.
So, just a
Mhm.
little bit of background. So, Metchnikoff has sort of this messy relationship with the scientists that are contemporary to him. So, Pasteur loves him. He's like working with him. He's at the Pasteur Institute, and
Mhm.
he loves him. Um, on the flip side, there are a lot of German scientists who don't like him, because there's a lot of tension between Germany and France after the Franco-Prussian War, and he is
Mhm.
in Paris at the Pasteur Institute. So a lot of German
Oh.
scientists are like, no, thank you. He did have a lot of French and British scientists in his corner, including our friend Joseph Lister, who supported him very
I
early on in
was
this theory.
I was gonna say, I wonder what Lister thought about this. I think he would
Yeah.
be a fan.
Lister was a very big fan. Metchnikoff also had a little bit of a temper, and so it was
Oh.
very difficult to get people on board with his theory, both for political reasons and personal reasons.
Mhm.
There was also a competing theory, which I think we've alluded to in past episodes. So, another scholar named Robert Koch defended humoral theory, which is the idea that the body is made up of four humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, and that an imbalance
Right.
of these different humors causes disease. So, Metchnikoff is presenting a competing theory that says that the humoral theory isn't actually a real thing, and it's these microbes that are causing disease, and they're these phagocytes or certain types of cells in your body that are preventing disease. And the bile or the humoral theory is actually not something that has a lot of weight behind it. So this
Mhm.
was very controversial. After he presented his findings for the very first time, a lot of scientists were very eager to try to replicate his results. So these
Mhm.
results were replicated in many different organisms, including mammals, like larger animals like dogs and cats, and also, in smaller organisms that were much simpler, like worms and lizards and other reptiles.
Yeah.
There was also another line of research that was trying to quantify the response. So they were
Oh.
looking under a microscope to see how many cells, or these white blood cells, showed up at a site of injury. And what they found, which is again maybe a little obvious to us in the 21st century, that the bigger the injury or the bigger the insult, the more white blood cells that came to the site. So they were able to
Mhm.
count the number of cells and see how many there were and realize that it was actually proportionate. After all of this work and other people supported him, he was eventually awarded the Nobel Prize in 1908 as the father of immunology.
Wow. And I just had a thought too, like, going back to the beginning of this episode, the fact that this is happening in all the animals that people tested also really supports Darwin's theory, right? That all animals and all living things came from a common ancestor. The fact that we all have this very similar defense mechanism really speaks to that.
Definitely. I think that is spot on. At this point, Darwin has been around for maybe around like 40 or 50 years. So it's
Mhm.
not quite as gratingly new, but it's still
Right.
something that people are working on getting behind. But I totally agree that even though it's not as hot button, it is something that supports his theory, which is great.
Yeah, just keep adding to the pile of evidence. Yeah.
Yes, agreed. Agreed.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's won the Nobel Prize. At this point, he is super famous. He's a really famous scientist. He is a
Mhm.
superstar. People are obsessed with him. He basically has like rock star status at the Pasteur Institute. Like he can do whatever he wants. He's won a Nobel
Nice.
Prize.
Yeah.
Um, he also has a little bit of a savior complex. He
Oh.
wants to spread his gospel on microbes and immunology. Like he really cares about this. He's like, microbes are what causing all the problems in the world. And so when
Mhm.
he rode on public transportation, he would just like tell random people to be careful about microbes.
Oh, so
He
he's like a hypochondriac a little bit?
I think it's more that he just feels like everybody needs to know this truth that he
Ah,
has discovered.
yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just spread the knowledge.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay.
Exactly.
Got it.
So he boils everything he eats, even fruit, like peeled bananas or peeled like oranges and stuff. He thinks
Oh,
the peel isn't good enough. He thinks that skin doesn't protect you, so he was pouring boiling water on his skin. If he
oh,
went to a restaurant,
that's
he
not
would
good.
boil and sterilize all his utensils because he didn't want to deal with microbes. So he's definitely
Mhm.
a super fun guy to have
Yeah.
around.
Yeah, it's it is like a hypochondriac slash
Yeah,
OCD kind of thing has developed here, which is not good.
yeah, definitely. I totally agree. But then, his interest in microbes sort of expands. So he goes back to
Mhm.
his fascination with death and like preventing death. And he zeroes in on this one idea that the body is being poisoned as we age. So,
Oh.
thinking back to his early days studying nematode digestive systems, he thought that
Mhm.
the root of aging was in the large intestine. So
Hmm.
while he was studying different animals, he realized that animals like dogs and cats have really extensive digestive systems compared to birds and lizards. And he also notices that reptiles and birds tend to live a lot longer than dogs and cats. So he was really looking like at the tortoise, and he's like, this is living for a really long time, and their
Hmm.
digestive system is very simple relative to these bigger mammals.
Yeah.
And so then this led him to conclude that the large intestine must be causing direct harm to human lives.
Okay. That's actually not like that illogical of a leap. Like now we know that, the microbiome is a thing that affects your health. And so I'm actually quite impressed that he pinpointed the digestive system and the large intestine in any sort of capacity. That's actually quite impressive.
Yeah, I think you're going to be impressed by the rest of the story then. His idea that the large intestine was bad wasn't necessarily this like very new idea.
Hmm.
People have for a long time before this believed the digestive system was bad for the body, because even before we knew about germ theory, even if before we knew about microbes, people knew that what comes out of your digestive system in the back end is really
Hmm.
yucky, and we should avoid that. And so
Yes.
people just thought that everything that happens in your intestines before it exits your body is also bad. So people just
Hmm.
thought that the intestines were a cesspool.
Yeah.
So moving this idea into the 20th century, Metchnikoff thought that the intestines had microbes that caused rotting, which caused the deterioration that was associated with aging. And so his big question was, how do we prevent these microbes from basically eating us from the inside out?
Hmm.
And while he was trying to answer this, he learned that in Bulgaria, there's this entire population of centenarians. And centenarians, of course, are people who live to be 100 or more.
Yeah.
And he is obsessed with people who live forever because he's trying to escape death. He's like, how do I beat this in some way? So he goes
Yes.
out to find what this village is doing differently. And drumroll, it's yogurt.
Yogurt. Really? Wait, what? I mean, okay, interesting. Because yogurt has all these like probiotics, so I see some connection there, but I didn't think it
You're,
would have that big of an effect. Like,
you're totally on the right track about the probiotics, the microbiome. You're right there with Metchnikoff right now.
okay.
So he proposed
Fascinating.
that the toxic bacteria in the gut, like all these microbiomes, could be killed by lactic acid and what we now know as probiotics, which are found in fermented milk and yogurt. And he goes so far to say that yogurt will prolong life and prevent aging and make people live forever. And he called probiotics orthobiosis, which was very new. This is
Mhm.
sort of side comment, but he talks about orthobiosis, but basically, this idea of probiotics in general was ignored during his lifetime. Nowadays, we talk about it all the time and how important it is for gut health, but people didn't catch on to probiotics until actually the mid 1990s, so
Oh,
many
wow.
century later. So back to his yogurt discovery. In
Yes.
1904, he gives a talk to the public, so not just scientists. And he starts off by talking about how bad aging is. And he's like, people are no longer useful to society. They're totally useless as they age. They're in pain. They're close to death. And
Mhm.
he tells the audience about this amazing discovery he made that yogurt can prevent aging. And he's like, there's these people in Bulgaria who are living to be over 100. They're eating yogurt every day. And he's kind of like
Y
used car salesman a little bit.
yeah. I can totally imagine it. Did he also just start eating, like, a ridiculous amount of yogurt?
He
Because
does do that. Yes, he does do
I
that.
yeah, I knew it because I was like, "This guy's boiling his knives and forks, and he's just gonna consume gallons of yogurt now." Yeah.
So he's kind of a salesman, and his audience aren't scientists, right? So there's still people who are like clinging to humoral theory or don't believe that science is real in the first place. So he's really trying to play to people's emotions to be like, aging sucks. Like, we don't want to age. Like, how do we not age? And
Yeah.
whatever he said, it worked because this started a global craze for yogurt. Yogurt was everywhere. It was on newspaper headlines all over the world. Doctors were recommending yogurt to their patients. They use it as like a disinfectant on for
What?
surgeries. I know.
Oh my god, for surgeries? Oh my god.
Yeah.
Okay.
Pharmacies were carrying yogurt. Like, people could not get enough. And even brands that we know today, like Kellogg and Dannon, got their
Mhm.
start in the yogurt industry.
Oh,
And
really?
the fact that
Wow.
we even today eat yogurt, like I had yogurt for breakfast this morning. The fact
Mhm.
that we even eat this and the fact that it is so common in so many different cultures, and that it's actually one of the most common quote unquote health foods in so many different
Yeah.
cultures is really because Metchnikoff popularized it. Like, yogurt was not a thing until he said that it was something that could make people live forever. And like, now I think yogurt has
Wow.
sort of moved away from that, but it's still considered a very health food.
Oh,
And
yeah.
the only reason that we eat it in so many different forms is because of Metchnikoff.
So, oh,
Exactly.
that's so funny. My mom is gonna be so happy about this episode because yogurt is like her comfort food. Like, health benefits aside, she doesn't I don't think she even really cares about that, although that's a good perk. But
It's a
she
good part.
just like whenever she's like, "Oh, what do I wanna eat?" It's yogurt. She wants to eat yogurt. So
She'll be really happy.
she's gonna be
She
so happy.
she has a big thank you to give to Metchnikoff because it was
Yes.
definitely him. So he is a celebrity. He's a crazy celebrity, but he's a celebrity. And people worshipped him, but like all celebrities, people also hated him. So he also
Mhm.
got a lot of negative publicity about the yogurt, that he was crazy, that he was a quack. He was making all these claims that, yogurt was the next snake oil that was going to, cure everyone. And
Yeah.
he took this really personally. So he started to change his stance, and he explained that people going crazy for yogurt wasn't what he actually wanted. What he really wanted was
Mhm.
for people to accept this theory that aging was a science and something that could be prevented with science. But he really did
Mhm.
think that the mania was quite silly, and that he never really believed that it was going to cure everything, but just wanted people to understand the science of aging.
Yeah.
This became abundantly apparent when, in his mid 50s, he started having kidney trouble and started worrying about his own mortality. And as
Mhm.
much as he thought about aging and preventing death, and for all his yogurt consumption, because he ate it every single day,
Yeah.
he was not able to prevent any of the changes in his own body. Despite all of this, he's still obsessed with the fact that aging is one of the world's biggest problems, and there was hardly anybody studying it. And
Mhm.
so he comes up with another theory that if people live long enough, they will develop a death instinct. So there's this
Okay.
quote where he says, "This instinct must be accompanied by marvelous sensations better than any other we are capable of experiencing." So basically, what this means that at a certain point, he thinks that once we've lived long enough, that the
Mhm.
death instinct would kick in and people would be happy and willing to accept death.
Oh, interesting. So it's like a psychological thing that you're like, "Okay, I've lived a full life.
Yes.
I'm done now. I can go now."
Yes.
And it would be kind of like a calming thing because, like, when you're young, you're scared of death, but then the older you get, a lot of times people are like, "Okay, I've accepted it. I've lived a good life." And that's what he was calling the death instinct.
I think it's even more than that. I think it's
Hmm.
less of an acceptance, but more of a willingness. Like, people want to die now.
Oh, okay. Taking a step further.
Like, their instinct now is that their life is over and now they want to die. So I think it's less of this, like, yeah, acceptance or just
Passive.
like,
Yeah.
yes.
It's
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 like,
less passive. Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
So he goes to this very large French hospital, La Salpêtrière. I don't know how to say that.
Okay. Nailed it. You're not French? No?
Which is kind of infamous. It's this public hospital, so people are generally kind of scared of it. So it's public, it's maybe not the best care, and to say this in maybe like the least morbid way possible, Metchnikoff goes there to interview people who are probably going to die. So he goes around asking them what they wanted, and he's asking them how they feel, and he's really hoping to find this death instinct. And he's
Mhm.
disappointed because even like really old people who are sick and like very clearly going to die soon did not want to die. And this hospital was this like really sad place that you probably didn't want to be. And even then, even in these like horrible circumstances where people are sick, they're in this kind of like sad place, they don't want to
Mhm.
die, they want to live. And so after he experienced this and he saw that, maybe the death instinct isn't something real or isn't something that people are able to explain,
Yeah.
He doubles down on the fact that aging is a disease and science is the only way to cure it. So
Mm-hmm.
he elaborates on this theory and says, if we can cure aging because it's a disease through science and people live until like 150 or 200, then at that point, the death instinct finally will appear and people won't suffer anymore. So his idea was that instead of having this like long, elongated period where people are not mobile, they're suffering, they're in pain, they're sick. They just don't have that.
Mm-hmm.
And when they're at the end of a long, happy, full life, they will welcome death. And that's when the death instinct will happen and there won't be any more suffering.
Interesting. I would have thought it would be the opposite almost. Like, again, kind of getting morbid. But, I would almost feel like if you did have a really long, painful illness at the end, you would just be like,
Be like, get
please
me out of here.
end
Yeah.
it. Yeah. Like, but he's actually coming up with the opposite idea that, I don't know, there's some like satisfaction to be achieved from living a happy, long, fulfilling life.
Yeah. No, you're totally right. And so he chases this death instinct, but I mean, he had these really big dreams, but he was also a
Mhm.
sick man. So he doesn't actually end up solving the mystery of aging.
Mhm.
He dies in 1916 in Paris from heart failure, likely related to his kidney trouble. He donates his body to science and medical research. And his urn is actually still at the Pasteur Institute in Paris.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, he definitely had a very wacky personality. In addition to that, like he's Russian and he's Jewish, and so he puts him
Mhm.
as kind of an outsider in the very largely British, German, French medical scientists that he was contemporaries with and hanging out with. It also really seems like based on the story that he had like no chill whatsoever. Like I
Yeah.
like I said that he had a temper, but he was also one of those guys who was really smart and also knew it. So after
Mhm.
reading all about him, he really strikes me as the kind of person who sits in the front row of the classroom and answers all of the questions, but like in a really annoying way, like he's kind of a
Yeah.
know-it-all. So it really does make sense that his colleagues had very mixed feelings about him, that they were like not always super excited when
Mhm.
he was like, "Hey guys, I have this new thing." They were like, "Okay, what now, bro?" You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. What now, yogurt boy?
Yeah, exactly. I really think that's how
Yeah.
people viewed him because he's kind of a
Mhm.
know-it-all.
Yeah.
Um, all that aside, he was very talented and he had this drive to solve aging, which opened up this new field of immunology and innate immunity and gerontology, which continues to be a big area of research today.
Oh my gosh.
Um,
I forgot that he like started immunology at the beginning of this. I was like all into because I was like, oh yeah, the microbiome. He's actually like for all his eccentricities, he's not that far off because I
no.
still know like there are aging studies where people are connecting diet to longevity. I actually know scientists, like actual scientists, who have changed their eating habits in order because of their research, because of like their
Yeah.
research into longevity. And they're like, oh, I figured this thing out. And so I'm going to eat foods that are high in this particular nutrient or this particular, fat or whatever it is. They're like, eating an abundance of avocados or something, and I'm like, all
Totally.
right,
Yeah,
you
I
do it,
completely agree with you.
So
No, in some ways he was for sure ahead of his time,
yeah,
but in some ways also
a
not.
little bit weird.
Yeah.
just just a little bit, but genius,
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. So that's the story of Eli Metchnikoff.
That was a really good story. Thank you so much to Margaret.
So
That was
much.
a great recommendation. Thank you so much. I love it. Thanks for listening, everybody. If you have a suggestion for a story we should cover or thoughts you want to share about an episode, reach out to us at smarttpodcast.com. Follow us on social media and listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. We release new episodes every other Wednesday. See you next time.